Hello, greetings, and good day to everybody. I am Professor Jun Cajigal, and for this video, we will be focusing on the muscular system. So before we proceed to our discussion on the muscular system, please like and share this online lecture so that we could reach more students, especially those taking life sciences. Alright, so I want your full attention now and let us proceed with our detailed discussion of the muscular system. Hello, greetings, and welcome to this online lecture on the muscular system. Now, before we go into the details of the muscular system, I guess it is proper to enumerate the general functions of the muscular system. Now, the muscular system is composed of specialized cells called muscle fibers, and their predominant function is contractibility. Now, contractibility simply means that this tissue is capable of shortening, and muscles, where attached to bones or internal organs and blood vessels, are responsible for movement. And nearly all movements in the body is the result of muscle contraction. Also, we have to take note that the muscular system also functions in the maintenance of posture, joint stability, and heat production. And remember that 85% of the heat produced in the body is the result of muscular contraction. So at this point, let us now identify the different types of muscle tissue. Now, there are three types of muscle tissue. We have the skeletal muscle, we have the smooth muscle, and the cardiac muscle. So let us now go into the details of these types of muscles, starting with the skeletal muscle, also known as striated or involuntary muscle. Now, the muscle is called skeletal because this type of muscle is attached to our bones or our skeletal framework. And the skeletal muscle is responsible for skeletal movements. And the basic unit of this type of muscle tissue is the muscle fiber with many nuclei, or in short, this muscle tissue is multi-nucleated. These muscle fibers are striated. It is called striated muscle because under the microscope, they have striations or stripes or streaks. These muscle fibers are striated, having transverse streaks or stripes, and each muscle fiber acts independently. Also, the peripheral portion of the central nervous system or CNS controls the skeletal muscle. So in short, these muscles are under conscious or voluntary control. So again, this muscle tissue is called skeletal muscle because this type of muscle is attached to our body framework or the skeletal system or to our bones. And if you will look closely under the microscope, this type of muscle has many striations or stripes or transverse streaks. And this muscle is under voluntary control, or it is under the control of the central nervous system. Alright, so again, the skeletal muscle is the muscle that is attached to our bones. And the tissue where the muscle is attached to the bone is called the tendon. And these muscle cells are multi-nucleated, or they have many nuclei. And under the microscope, they have many striations or stripes or streaks. And this type of muscle is under the central nervous system, so it is under conscious or voluntary control. And the cells are surrounded and bundled by connective tissue. Now, the next type of muscle is called smooth muscle, also known as visceral muscle or involuntary muscle. Now, this type of muscle is called visceral muscle because this muscle is found in the walls of the hollow internal organs of our body, such as blood vessels, the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, bladder, and uterus. And also, this type of muscle is under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And because of that, this muscle cannot be controlled consciously and thus act involuntarily. That's why this muscle is also known as involuntary muscle. And if you will examine this muscle under the microscope, you will notice that there are no bands or there are no striations or stripes. That's why this type of muscle is also called smooth muscle. And again, if you will examine the muscle under the microscope, the muscle cells are spindle-shaped and has one central nucleus. And also, smooth muscles contract slowly and rhythmically. So, if you will examine this muscle tissue under the microscope, you will notice that this muscle tissue does not exhibit any banded or belted appearance, meaning that this muscle tissue doesn't have any striations or stripes or transverse streak. That's why this type of muscle is called smooth muscle. And looking closely at this muscle tissue, you will notice that the muscle cells, they are spindle-shaped with a central nucleus. So what are the characteristics of the smooth muscle tissue? So again, there are no striations, there are no stripes, or no transverse streak. And the muscle cells are spindle-shaped with a central nucleus. And this muscle is under the control of the autonomic nervous system, so this muscle acts involuntarily or it is not under conscious control. And lastly, this type of muscle is found mainly in the walls of hollow internal organs. That's why this muscle is called visceral muscle. And also, let's not forget that this type of muscle contracts slowly and rhythmically. And lastly, the next type of muscle is called cardiac muscle or the myocardium. Now, the cardiac muscle is found only in the muscular wall of the heart. And this type of muscle, the cardiac muscle or the myocardium, is also under the control of the autonomic nervous system. The cardiac muscle cell has one central nucleus like a smooth muscle, but also under the microscope, the muscle exhibits a banded or striated appearance like a skeletal muscle. And the cardiac muscle cell is rectangular in shape, and the contraction of the cardiac muscle is involuntary, strong, and rhythmical. So that's the cardiac muscle or the myocardium. And again, the characteristics of the cardiac muscle or the myocardium are the following. So if you will look closely at this muscle under the microscope, you will notice that this type of muscle also exhibits a banded or belted appearance, meaning there are stripes or striations just like a skeletal muscle. Also, this type of muscle, the cardiac muscle or the myocardium, has a central single nucleus just like a smooth muscle. and this muscle is joined to other cardiac muscle cells, and this is under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So this type of muscle contracts involuntarily, and also this muscle is found only in the muscular wall of the heart. So those are the characteristics of the cardiac muscle or the myocardium. Now let's take a look at naming or identifying skeletal muscles. Now skeletal muscles are named or identified based on the following. Number 1, we have the direction of the muscle fibers. Number 2, we have the location of the skeletal muscle. Number 3, we have the size of the skeletal muscle. Number 4, the number of origins. Number 5, the shape of the skeletal muscle. And lastly, number 6, we have the origin and insertion. Now let's take a look at naming or identifying skeletal muscles based on the direction of the muscle fibers. Now in this case, we make use of the midline as our reference. Now if the muscle fibers, they are parallel to the midline, we call that rectus, like rectus abdominis. Now if the muscle fibers are perpendicular to the midline, we call that transverse, like transverse abdominis. And if the muscle fibers, they are diagonal to the midline, we call them oblique, like external oblique. Now let's take a look at location as a basis for naming skeletal muscle. Now what does this mean? Now using location as a basis for identifying or naming skeletal muscles, this simply means the structure near which muscle is found. Like for example, frontalis. So the term frontalis means that the muscle is near the frontal bone, which is part of the skull. Or the term or the name occipitalis, so that means that the muscle is near the occipital bone, also part of the skull. Now what about the size of the muscle as a basis for naming skeletal muscle? Now in terms of size, we need to consider the following. First, we have the relative size of the muscle and the length of the skeletal muscle. Now in terms of the relative size of the muscle, now the largest muscle is called maximus, like gluteus maximus. Now if the muscle is middle size, we call that medius, such as gluteus medius. And if the muscle is the smallest, we call that minimus, like gluteus minimus. Alright, now what about the length of the skeletal muscle? Now the longest muscle is named longus, like fibularis longus. Then the short muscle is called brevis, like fibularis brevis. And the shortest muscle is called tertius, like fibularis tertius. So that's how we name and identify skeletal muscles on the basis of size. And again, the muscles gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and minimus that makes up our butt. Alright. And also we can name and identify skeletal muscles on the basis of the number of origins. Now when we speak of origin, origin refers to the point of attachment of the muscle to an immovable bone. And muscles are attached to our bones by means of tendons. Tendons, they attach muscles to bones. Now, in this basis of naming skeletal muscles, we count the number of tendons of origin. Now, if the muscle has two origins, we call that biceps, like biceps brachii or biceps femoris. Now, if the muscle has three origins, then we call that triceps, like triceps brachii. Now, if there are four origins, we call that quadriceps, like quadriceps femoris. Now, what about the shape of the muscle as a basis for naming and identifying the skeletal muscle? Now, in terms of the relative shape of the muscle, we make use of the following terms or names. Now, if the muscle is triangular in shape, we make use of the term or name deltoid. Like that, in our shoulder, there is a triangular shaped muscle called the deltoid muscle. Now, if the muscle is trapezius in shape, we make use of the term or name trapezius. If the muscle is saw-toothed, we make use of the term serratus. If the muscle is rhomboid in shape, like that of the muscle in our back, we call that rhomboideus muscle. And if the muscle is rounded in shape, we make use of the term teres. So that's how we name skeletal muscles on the basis of its relative shape. So again, if the muscle is shaped like a triangle, we make use of the term deltoid. Like that of the muscle in our shoulder, there is a triangular shaped muscle called the deltoid muscle. If the muscle is shaped like a trapezoid, we make use of the term trapezius, like the trapezius muscle in our back. Then if the muscle is saw-toothed, we make use of the term serratus, like the muscles just below the armpit. And if the muscle is rhomboid in shape, we make use of the term rhomboideus, like the rhomboideus muscle also in our back. And lastly, we can name and identify skeletal muscles on the basis of the origin and insertion. Now, I mentioned earlier that the term origin means that is the point of attachment of the muscle to an immovable bone. And when we speak of insertion, that refers to the point of attachment of the muscle to a movable bone. And again, muscles are attached to our bones by means of tendons. So on this basis of origin and insertion, we have this example like the term iliocostalis muscle. So iliocostalis means that the muscle is attached to the ilium, which is part of the pelvis and ribs. So the term costal means ribs. Ilium is part of our pelvic bone. So that's how we name and identify skeletal muscles. Now at this point, let us now identify the parts of a skeletal muscle. Now we mentioned this earlier that the point of attachment to an immovable bone is what we call the origin of the muscle, and the point of attachment of the muscle to a movable bone is called the insertion. And again, muscles are attached to our body framework or to our bones by means of tendons. And the thicker middle region of the muscle is known as the belly of the muscle. So those are the parts of a skeletal muscle. And again, skeletal muscles are attached to our body framework or bones by means of tendons. The point of attachment of a skeletal muscle to an immovable bone is what we call the origin, and the point of attachment of the skeletal muscle to a movable bone is what we call the insertion. Now at this point, let us now study muscle action. Now we have to take note that muscles, they usually work in pairs. Now, a good example of this would be the pair of muscles working together can be seen in the human arm. The muscle at the front of the arm is called the biceps muscle, and the muscle at the back of the arm is called the triceps muscle. Now, when the biceps muscle is working or the muscle is contracted, the triceps muscle is relaxed. Now, when the triceps muscle is contracted, then the biceps muscle is relaxed, as you could see in this animated illustration. Now, this type of muscle action is called antagonistic muscle action because they always work in opposite ways. So again, if the biceps muscle is contracted, the triceps muscle is relaxed. On the other hand, if the triceps muscle is contracted, the biceps muscle is relaxed. And this is what we call antagonistic muscle movement. So you have to realize that basically all bodily movement involves two muscles working together in the opposite way. So we call this antagonistic muscle action. Now, in the case of bending and straightening of the arm, two muscles are involved. We have the biceps muscle and the triceps muscle. Now, if you want to bend the arm, then the biceps muscle is contracted, the triceps muscle is relaxed. Then if you want to straighten the arm, then the triceps muscle is contracted, the biceps muscle is relaxed. So basically all bodily movement involves two muscles working in pairs and in opposite ways. So we call that antagonistic muscle action. So isn't that fascinating that the simple body movement of bending and straightening of the arm involves two muscles working in pairs and in opposite ways. So we have the biceps muscle and the triceps muscle. Now, if you want to bend the arm, then the biceps muscle is contracted, the triceps muscle is relaxed. And if you want to straighten the arm, then the triceps muscle is contracted, the biceps muscle is relaxed. And again, this is what we call antagonistic muscle action. And because of this, we have the following. We have what we call a flexor muscle. A flexor muscle bends a body part or decreases the angle at a joint, like the biceps muscle. The biceps muscle is a flexor muscle. Now, an extensor muscle straightens a body part or increases the angle at a joint, like the triceps muscle. The triceps muscle is an extensor muscle. Then if the muscle moves the bone away from the midline, you call that an abductor muscle. The opposite of that is an adductor muscle that moves the bone towards the midline. Now, if the muscle moves the body part upward, then you call that a levator muscle. The opposite of that is a depressor muscle that produces downward movement. So again, if you will notice, muscle movement involves two muscles working in pairs and in opposite ways. So that's what we call antagonistic muscle action. So at this point, let us now study the physiology of muscle contraction. Now, in order for us to understand the physiology of muscle contraction, we need to take a look at the anatomy of a typical muscle. Now, the entire muscle is surrounded by a membrane which is continuous with the tendons. And we call that membrane the epimysium. Now, if you will cut the belly of the muscle cross-sectionally, you will notice that the belly has sections called fascicles. A fascicle is surrounded by a membrane called the perimysium. And inside the fascicle are sections called muscle fibers or the muscle cell itself. The muscle fiber or the muscle cell is surrounded by a membrane called the endomysium. Alright, and a muscle fiber is composed of myofibrils, and there are two myofibrils. We have the actin and the myosin filaments. So with this, let us now study the physiology of muscle contraction. Now, muscle contraction again involves the actin and myosin myofibrils. Now, these two proteins, actin and myosin, they are responsible for muscle contractions. Now, muscle contraction happens when actin filaments actually slide over the myosin filaments. This slide causes a change in the shape of the muscle cells, so the muscle cells shorten, producing movement, which is considered as a muscular contraction. And this explanation of how muscles contract is called the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. So everybody kindly take a look at this animated illustration of these myofibrils, the actin and the myosin filaments. So the red lines, those are the actin filaments, and those blue thick lines at the middle, those are the myosin filaments. So you will notice that the actin slides between the myosin filaments. So when this happens, the muscle shortens and that will produce contraction. So that's how we explain the physiology of muscle contraction. Alright, so at this point, let us now watch this short video about the muscular system. Alright, so let's watch this.
It's been quite a task, but we just finished learning about the structure of muscle tissue as well as the process by which muscles contract, allowing us to walk, jump, blink, and breathe. So we are now ready to learn about all the different muscles in our bodies by name, which together comprise the muscular system. There are hundreds of muscles in the body, so we won't name every single one, but we will go through some important points, as well as a number of the major muscles and muscle groups. First, how can we classify muscles? Let's start by grouping them according to function. We must realize that muscles specifically contract and do not expand, which means that muscles can only pull, they do not push. So complex motion requires many muscles working together in interesting ways. The four functions we will examine are as follows. First, there are prime movers, or agonists. These are muscles that have a primary responsibility in producing a particular motion. Muscles that oppose a particular movement are called antagonists. This can help provide resistance and produce more delicate motions. Next, there are synergists. These help the prime movers either by contributing additional force or reducing undesirable movements that could occur as the prime mover contracts. So we can think of synergists as stabilizers in a certain sense. And lastly, when synergists immobilize a bone, they are called fixators. This includes muscles that maintain our posture. So there we have prime movers, antagonists, synergists, and fixators. And interestingly, a particular muscle can exhibit more than one of these roles, depending on what kind of motion it is producing. Skeletal muscles also have specific names, and they are named according to any of 7 specific criteria. Let's be aware of these criteria, even if we don't go over the name of every single muscle. First, there is muscle location. For example, the temporalis is adjacent to the temporal bone. Next, there is muscle shape. The left trapezius muscles are roughly trapezoidal in shape. Then muscle size. We will see words like maximus, minimus, longus, and brevis in a number of muscles, and these mean that the muscle is large, small, long, or short, respectively. Examples include the gluteus maximus and the gluteus minimus. Next, the direction of muscle fibers. Sometimes these run in a particular direction with reference to a particular line, like the midline of the body or the axis of a bone. Rectus means parallel, transversus means perpendicular, and oblique means at some angle. So the rectus femoris is a muscle whose fibers run parallel to the long axis of the femur. Next, we can consider the number of origins. Biceps, triceps, and quadriceps have 2, 3, and 4 origins respectively. Then we can discuss the location where the muscle attaches to other structures. Here we list the point or points of origin followed by the point of insertion, such as with the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which has origins on the sternum and clavicle and inserts on the mastoid process. And lastly, we can name muscles according to the type of motion they produce, like a flexor, extensor, or adductor. With these criteria understood, we should have a reasonable capacity to know something about the function of a muscle from its name. Now let's look at different muscle shapes. The fascicles of a muscle, which as we recall are bundles of muscle fibers, can arrange themselves in a variety of ways to produce muscles in a variety of shapes. If in concentric rings, we can get a circular muscle, like the ones around the eyes and mouth. If they are spread out over a region but all converge towards a tendon of insertion, that is a convergent muscle, like the pectorals. If they taper down to a tendon at two ends, that is called fusiform, like the biceps. If the fascicles run in a straight line parallel to the long axis of the muscle, that is a parallel arrangement, like with the sartorius muscle found in the thigh. And lastly, in a pennate muscle, fascicles are short and run at oblique angles, and they can be unipennate, where muscle sits on one side of a tendon, bipennate, with muscle on both sides resembling a feather, or multipennate, which looks like several feathers inserted into the same tendon. These different shapes determine the range of motion that the muscle can produce. Any skeletal muscle can only contract by about 30%, so the muscles with fascicles that run parallel to its long axis will shorten the most, but sacrifice some power. The muscles with many fibers at oblique angles will shorten less, but produce more power. Now it's time to look at specific muscles as they are arranged in the body. As most viewers of this tutorial probably have no specific need to memorize hundreds of muscle names, we will display just a few major ones right now over the course of a few images. Should you feel the need to memorize any of these, feel free to pause the clip in full screen mode and take a screenshot for later reference. Otherwise, just try to gain a vague familiarity. If you decide to go into a medical field, don't worry, you will see a lot more of these later. We just learned about the structure of muscle, like skeletal muscle, which is what allows you to move your body around. But how exactly does this work? If you decide to lift your arms up in the air, what is happening on the molecular level that produces this motion? It's not magic, it's just a staggering amount of chemistry. So let's dive back down into those muscle fibers and get a closer look. As we recall, any skeletal muscle is made of fascicles, and each fascicle is made of muscle fibers, which are the individual multinucleated muscle cells. From there, we can zoom in farther on one of these myofibrils, which are in turn comprised of myofilaments arranged into sarcomeres. And this is the contractile unit, the one that lets muscles do what they do. Now let's get a closer look at these structures, because this is where all the action happens. Looking at a sarcomere, we can label a few regions. We can see these darker A bands and the lighter I bands, which are aligned and responsible for the striated appearance of skeletal muscle. Within each A band, we can find a lighter region called the H zone, and this H zone is split down the middle by something called the M line, made of a protein called myosin. The I bands are also split down the middle by a region called the Z disc. We can identify an individual sarcomere as being a section from one Z disc to the next, and this is the functional unit of skeletal muscle. If we zoom in even more, we can see the myofilaments that make up these regions. As we discussed previously, the thick filaments contain myosin, and these extend across the A band, connected at the M line. The thin filaments contain actin, extending across the I band and into the A band. There are also elastic filaments made of titin, spanning from the Z discs to the thick filament, and then continuing on, acting as the core of the thick filament. Now let's zoom in even further on these two main types of filaments. Myosin is a protein with two globular heads pointing outwards and a long tail, which contributes to the structure of the filament. The heads are the site of all the activity, since there are ATP binding sites, as well as actin binding sites, meaning this is where the thick and thin filaments will interact by making cross bridges. It's important to note the lack of myosin heads in the center of the sarcomere, just as there also are no thin filaments. Speaking of those, as we said, they are made predominantly of actin, and two actin filaments will twist together to form the backbone of the thin filament. Each actin subunit has an active site where myosin can bind, and when a muscle fiber is relaxed, these are blocked by spiraling strands of tropomyosin. There is also troponin, a globular complex of 3 polypeptides, one of which binds to actin, one of which binds to tropomyosin, and one of which binds calcium. Beyond this, we must be aware of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, a series of tubules that surround each myofibril. These regulate levels of calcium, which is needed for muscle contraction through storage and release. This structure includes the T-tubules, which sit at each A-band, I-band junction, encircling each sarcomere and helping signals reach every region of the muscle cell. Now that we've examined each structural component, let's describe how everything works using the sliding filament model of contraction. This says that when the nervous system stimulates muscle fibers, the myosin heads on the thick filaments will interact with the binding sites on the actin subunits. These attachments will form and break several times as the thick filaments pull the thin filaments in towards the center of the sarcomere, thus pulling the Z discs towards the M line. The I bands shorten and the H zone disappears. The overall effect is that the A bands from adjacent sarcomeres get closer together, so the entire muscle cell will shorten. This is the mechanism by which muscles contract. Now the question is, how is all of this activity initiated? As we said, this begins with a signal from the nervous system. We will examine that system in detail a bit later, but for now we can just examine the interface between the nervous system and a skeletal muscle. This is called the neuromuscular junction. Each muscle fiber has one, and these sections, called axon terminals, are nearly touching the muscle fiber, separated only by a thin space called the synaptic cleft, where the muscle produces junctional folds within the postsynaptic membrane. The axon terminal has lots of synaptic vesicles, which are like little bubbles containing acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. When a nerve impulse reaches the end of an axon by a mechanism we will discuss later, the axon terminal will release acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The junctional folds contain acetylcholine receptors, so these will bind to the approaching acetylcholine, which causes a conformational change. Once a particular threshold voltage is reached, this will generate an action potential. Sodium can now diffuse into the cell anywhere along the membrane. While this is happening, an enzyme in the synaptic cleft called acetylcholinesterase will break down acetylcholine, and the ion channel closes, preventing further muscle contraction until another nerve impulse arrives. But the action potential will continue to propagate along the sarcolemma and down the T-tubules, which opens up calcium ion release channels, which we will discuss in a moment. So we can see that charge distribution and electric potential are key concepts here. But how does that relate to muscle contraction? Well, the action potential generated will initiate excitation-contraction coupling. As we said, the propagation of the action potential causes a rise in levels of calcium in the cytosol, and this is what causes the filaments to slide. Let's recall that when a muscle cell is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding sites on the actin subunits. But as more and more calcium ions become present, these will bind to troponin, and once two ions bind, it will change shape, which will push tropomyosin off of the myosin binding sites, making them available for cross-bridge cycling, the process we mentioned before. In this process, the myosin heads will pivot and bend, pulling the actin filament along and using ATP in the process. The two positions possible for the heads allow it to pull, detach, change position, bind, pull, detach, and so forth many times until contraction is complete. As calcium levels deplete, troponin returns to its original shape. Tropomyosin blocks actin's binding sites once more, and the muscle fiber relaxes. There is a lot more to discuss regarding muscle contraction. We could talk about the time frames associated with each step in muscle contraction. We could talk about graded muscle responses, or the differences in contraction for smooth muscle versus skeletal. But we will have to leave that for another day, since it's best to really understand the basics first. Before moving forward, let's quickly review what we discussed. Muscle contraction in a skeletal muscle begins when a signal arrives at the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine is released, which binds to receptors on the sarcolemma. Sodium and potassium ions move through the ion channels, which results in a local change in membrane voltage, also called depolarization. This initiates an action potential, which travels across the sarcolemma in all directions, eventually along T-tubules. This is where calcium ions are released, which interact with the myofilaments such that myosin and actin are able to bind, and contraction begins.
Alright, so I hope you have learned a lot about the muscular system through that short video. Now, before we end, I just would like to point out some problems involving the muscular system. So we have the following, such as muscular dystrophy that involves the weakening of the muscles, Then we have inguinal hernia. This involves the intestine that bulges through the abdominal muscle. Then we have muscle cramps, which involves a sudden and painful contraction of the muscle, usually at night or when exercising. Then we have strain, which involves overstretching and possible tearing of the muscle because of overuse. Then we have tendinitis, which involves the inflammation of the tendons because of aging or too much exercise. And lastly, we have shin splints, which involves pain or irritation of the shin. Alright, so I guess that's about it for our online lecture involving the muscular system. So please like and share this video so that we could reach more students, especially those taking life sciences. Alright, so this is your lecturer, Professor Jun Cajigal, saying, live long and prosper. Alright, see you in my next video. Okay, so long for now. Bye-bye.